All right, welcome, folks. Glad that you've joined us today. There are still people coming in, so we'll admit more folks as they come. Our the talk today is being recorded, just FYI. Okay, welcome everyone to this month's Buen Vivir talk. My name is Bernadette Rogers with Scientist Rebellion Turtle Island, and I'm the moderator for today's discussion with our exciting guest speaker, Serena Mendizabal. Sorry. Buen Vivir is a monthly series of presentations on global, social, and climate justice, typically held on the last Wednesday of each month at this time. Buen Vivir is the most common translation for the Indigenous Quechua concept of sumac cauce, life lived in harmony with nature and community. While Buen Vivir is sometimes translated into English as a good life, a more accurate translation is living well. Buen Vivir relates to a deeper understanding of how humankind and the impacts of our lives affect the planet and each other. And our speaker today, I think, is a great one to address us on this topic. Today's speaker is Serena Mendizabal. She is a Cayuga Wolf Clan Panamanian woman from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, in what is known today as Canada. Serena is a community-based researcher, grassroots organizer, and environmental advocate, and has worked in climate, environment, and clean energy for almost a decade. Serena's desire to work in climate justice and clean energy comes directly from her community of Six Nations that has long been involved in frontline work, international advocacy, and land protection, and where she has organized since she was 10 years old. Serena is the managing director at Sacred Earth Solar, an Indigenous women-led organization supporting Indigenous communities in implementing climate solutions and healing justice. Sacred Earth Solar is one of the only Indigenous nonprofits implementing renewable energy and sustainable infrastructure through a climate justice approach. Through Sacred Earth Solar, Serena has implemented renewable energy and sustainable infrastructure projects alongside communities across Turtle Island. So welcome, Serena, and thank you for being with us today. We will have Serena will speak for 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have lots of time for questions at the end. So folks that are listening, please put your questions in the chat, and you can also follow along with the live stream, which I believe is on YouTube. But if you're here, you don't need to do that. Okay, Serena, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen here. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes, again.
Amazing. So I just want to say thank you to Scientist Rebellion Turtle Island for having me today. And it's been even just getting to know some of you has been really amazing to build relationships and camaraderie among each other, especially for those in Turtle Island and beyond. And yeah, thank you as well for the wonderful welcome. I really appreciate that to be able to share some of my learnings and teachings that I've gained over my 26 years of life. So I am much younger still at this point and fresh to the work. But today I will be sharing with you some of what I've learned over time and what I really believe are kinship approaches to a just transition, and really how I, as a Haudenosaunee woman, approach this work. So as Bernadette mentioned, I am Cayuga Wolf Clan from Six Nations of the Grand River, and this has been my home for all my life on the territory, and that's where I currently live with my partner and our two cats. And I'm managing director at Sacred Earth Solar, which she gave some background on. So when I think of home, this is the Grand River and where my family has been since we came post-American Revolution to find some safety and hopefully build the space and community for prosperity. And when I think of home, I think of the Carolinian forest and part as it's part of the last 10% remaining of Carolinian forest in Canada. And I think of all the non-human kin who also call this place home and have been living in reciprocity, hundreds of different species that I have always lived to be, that have always been the norm for me growing up. And I also think of our longhouses and I think of our culture and our ceremonies. And so for me, a lot of our ceremonies, they come back to the strawberries and the maple trees and our corn. And I think about the interdependent relationship that we have with them to be able to pass through our governance and pass through our ceremonies and to operate and be the Haudenosaunee. And so with us, some people say the translation as a Haudenosaunee person is the people of the Longhouse, but really some of us think it's just us Six Nations and coming together under unity and putting our weapons down and uniting as one collective people. And but for most people say the people of the Longhouse, which we do really love our longhouses, and this is our place of ceremony, our place of culture, governance. It's even our funerals and where my grandparents are buried. So while I think of all the beauty of home, though, I also think of all the terror, and Six Nations is completely surrounded by urbanization and industry. And so Six Nations is about an hour southwest of Toronto, the largest city in Canada. And that has really, you've been able to tell that from the land in which surrounds us. We have industry all over. We have a pipeline through our territory. We have over 30 hydroelectric dams on our river, and we also have a mine, a gypsum mine, right within our community. We also have different energy systems that are within our broader community, the Nanfan Treaty, which we like to say the Haldeman Tract is our home and the Nanfan Treaty is our backyard. And so we have this really rich history of being in contact with settlers, one of the first peoples to be in contact. And I think that really shows through the industry on our territory and how, with our leadership and our um, political presence within settler colonialism relations, that they really saw the sustenance that came from our land, and they've used that now to create industry that has been really detrimental. And so as I've grown up uh, in a world of extractivism, I've also grown up in a world of resistance. And since I was 8 years old, my people have been resisting actively through land conflict and land back occupations, protecting our territory. And so I'd say that's been since 2006 with Gunestado, and it was called the Protected Place, where Mackenzie Meadows, a housing development, was going to be placed. And it was right on the border of our territory. And it would be hundreds and hundreds of homes, hundreds of emissions, hundreds of different environmental impacts on lands where that are already encroaching on the bare minimum of our territory because we have only 5% remaining of that Haldeman tract. And so our people decided, no, this isn't going to happen, and ended up being in a months-long standoff with the OPP and the Ontario government over this territory. And that's really, I was 8 years old, so I grew up in the backdrop. And I did mention that this kind of land back occupation resistance has been going on for 20 years, but I'd also like to make mention that our resistance goes beyond that. As being some of the first peoples in contact with settlers, we actually created the two-row wampum or guswente. You stay in your ship, we'll stay in our canoe, and let's not interfere with each other and the sovereignty of our nations. Well, as we've known, they've interfered clearly from the level of industry and urbanization on our territory. I'd also say that this resistance has continued to and has informed this type of land back work, with our own people being the first Indigenous peoples to ever go to the United Nations to speak to the harms of Canada and the US on our sovereignty. And that's really what's brought us to 2006 and being very firm in our inherent rights as Haudenosaunee people, as well as our relationship to land and our relationship to our hereditary governance systems. So as an 8-year-old, that's a lot to take in, but this is really what's informed me is this level of action at 8 years old that I saw, this level of action in our community that has put me on a path towards really trying to explore what a true just transition is and what does land back look like for us. So it makes sense when I was coming home from university that I wanted to work in the community and I wanted to work to better our community in a way that would make us healthy. And so I ended up working at the Six Nations of the Grand River Development Corporation. And this development corporation was created in 2015, post Kathleen Wynne's Ontario coal phase out. And so Ontario wanted to phase out the coal, and I know many people who probably lived in Toronto remember the smog. I was quite young, but it was there. I'm having a hard time breathing. So it was definitely not only an energy crisis, but also a public health crisis with the impacts on cancer rates in the nearby communities. And obviously, as we can tell through Indian Act legislation and the interference of Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous peoples were left out of creating the past energy mix that we had seen, which was entirely based on fossil fuels. And we had the Nanticoke coal power plant. It was on the mouth of Lake Erie, which is only half an hour from our community, so extremely close to us. And it was one of Canada's top 10 emitters. And so with that phase out meant this also was project, the coal power plant was going to be decommissioned. And so our community said, okay, let's not make fault on what's going to come next and let's be proactive and create a solution. So they created the development corporation that would basically invest or build renewable energy projects across the country and has now built the largest First Nation clean energy portfolio in Canada and quite possibly the world. So that's where I ended up working because I was like, okay, energy transition, this sounds good. I want to do this. And I really worked with this other portfolio under the development corporation that was called Six Nations Future. It was basically an online platform used to share different information around the projects and engage and inform the community so that people could see the different steps and phases that the project was in. It sounds good. People thought this was really cool. This is the next level of community engagement, but it didn't end up well for me. And I was working in community engagement and consultation at the Development Corporation when our Development Corporation, the Hydro won the Ontario utility, and the Ontario government wanted to recommission the Niagara Reinforcement Line, a transmission line that would transmit about 800 megawatts of clean energy surplus across southern Ontario. And I was the one engaging with the people, and when you are in engagement, you have firsthand knowledge of if the community wants this project or not. And from this exact moment, the community did not want the project. And that is what I knew so clearly, that it was crossing through good soil, many plants, a variety of medicines, and wouldn't necessarily be providing the impact or benefits that the community would want. And so our community was protesting it for weeks. No, you didn't really consult with us that well. We're saying no, and you're still wanting to move forward on a project, even though many people in the community were saying no. And so having people protest meant, okay, what is the Hydro One utility going to do when Indigenous peoples are interfering with infrastructure projects? And I think for many of us in the movement, we know this all too clearly. They're going to get an injunction. So Hydro One takes legal action against the Haudenosaunee people through being granted an injunction through the Ontario court system. Therefore, if you were to protest on site at this project any longer, you will be criminalized. And I think for me, this really set the precedent around this criminalization that I felt wasn't necessarily embodying who we were as Haudenosaunee people. And working there, it did not feel right. And so I ended up leaving. And it's funny because I left and have dedicated my life towards this work of really trying to figure out what a true just transition looks like. But in 2025, we are still seeing the same replications of harm happening in Six Nations. And this is the Oneida Energy Storage Project that has now been, it's in partnership with some developers, the Ontario government is funding, the federal government's funding, and Six Nations. We are very minimal equity owners within this project, I think less than 25%. And I will say that most of our projects are less than 50%. So we are never majority owners in our projects. And so this Oneida Energy Storage Project is actually one of the biggest in Canada, could be possibly almost the biggest in the world. It's a 250 megawatt storage project that is basically taking the surplus from the grid and all the renewable energy, and being able to store that over time. So in actuality, I'm not completely against energy storage, but what I am against is projects moving forward without free, prior, and informed consent. And I think this is the real issue here, and how we see this replications of harm from the fossil fuel industry still being innate within capital projects that are moving forward within the major infrastructure that we're seeing across the country, because they did not engage my people. I think they had like 4 different sessions online for people to go to. That's very sad. They did in-person community engagement sessions, and they did them in every single community around Six Nations except for in the community, because they knew our people wouldn't want to hear it. So they already knew what the response was going to be, and they were pushing the project forward. This comes into time now. It was post the project's approval, and the Ontario government, I'm pretty sure, giving $50 million to it. And they came into my community of Six Nations, and they did not tell anyone. I only knew because I had a friend working on the project that the Christia Freeland and Doug Ford were going to come into our community. And this is after Doug Ford told the OPP to sic the OPP on us with our land back movements. And so no one knew. And so I sent out a mass message to everyone, and I said, okay, this is happening, come. And when the people came the next day to this big project announcement, they locked my people out. They locked our chiefs out. They locked our confederacy out. And they locked elders and young people who had to go to the washroom. Is this the transition for us? Is this what a community-led project looks like? And it really made me think at the end of the day, how do we implement community-led solutions? Because right now, there's a major difference with the projects going on across the country, where community-led versus First Nations owned. Are we letting developers and government continue to come into our community and need a check mark on their bids for the grid access, and having a little check mark around Indigenous participation, where we have limited equity within the overall project altogether and still facing the major impact on our lands, to then a community-led project that is coming from the ground up, that is rooted in the needs and desires of our people, that is coming from the young people who want to put forth projects, and is coming from what we envision for a shared climate future. And it's coming from people in the community working on it, instead of outside consultants or engineers who come and invade our spaces of sovereignty. So this is really what I've been grappling with. Okay, I think we need to focus on what truly is a community-led project. And I think when we have to put that into a lens, we need to think that colonialism, extractivism, and capitalism cause climate change and social injustice. Indigenous sovereignty, rights, and leadership create key solutions. So, having this embodiment and understanding around colonialism and extractivism and how it can replicate over time, and truly seeing, okay, what are the solutions that are sovereign, that lead with our rights, and that have our leadership in place. And so, this is where I ended up at Sacred Earth Solar. We're dedicated to promoting healthy relationships with the land and each other through implementing climate solutions and healing justice, committed to environmental stewardship. And so we partner with communities all across the countries who are on the front lines, and we support them with climate infrastructure projects, education and training, advocacy and policy support, as well as healing justice. And how at Sacred Earth, what we truly believe, a just transition from fossil fuels to climate solutions and renewable energy. It actually refers to a framework prioritizing social justice and equity in the transition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And for us, it is actually this just transition is much more than just renewable energy. It is guided by knowledge sharing and storytelling that is inherently uplifting to our communities. And when it comes to, okay, what is this Indigenous led just transition? It's really this expansive range of strategies, principles, and understandings that can transition whole communities to build thriving economies that provide dignified, productive, and ecologically sustainable livelihoods, democratic governance, and ecological resistance. For us, we focus on the importance of responsibility, relationships, sovereignty, and transformation for action, which comes directly from an organization, Indigenous Environmental Network, who has done major work towards the protection of our territories. And I think it's also bringing up the fact that renewable energy isn't perfect. It's not going to liberate us, and I can tell you that for sure. But what it can do is offer a constructive path forward. Renewable energy systems, they can have these amazing positive socioeconomic impacts on our communities. But if and when they're initiated by our communities and for our communities, it is essential to understand that renewable energy still requires extraction and, in many cases, the destruction of Mother Earth for the production of required materials. And this is where at Sacred Earth, we take our approach to a just transition by this intersection of clean energy and climate justice, and utilizing a justice framework and approach to our work. Because I think a lot of the time, clean energy has become so corporate. But when we take a justice lens, we know that we're here to achieve justice and liberation for all. And so, how do we do that through our projects? By uplifting Indigenous sovereignty. And we can see this as a holistic circle. And these are all the different areas that really come and take into what we need to think about for a transition. It is holistic, it is grounded, it comes from community, and it has many different portions and places that really encapsulate what a transition can look like. But with all of this being said, it always comes back to community, and community engagement and relationships are vital for any of this work. Getting your community involved helps keep your project connected to your needs and values, while at the same time supporting energy education and capacity building. The transition away from fossil fuel use towards renewable energy can bring your entire community a sense of hope, pride, and agency. And this is where I kind of get started on my own journey of really implementing projects. And this is a circle wampum of our people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And I think it's funny because I was just looking at my fingers because I have my clan family symbol on my fingers. That's a reminder of where I come and that I am one piece of one of these lines, because this is the 49 families in our confederacy who come together under the great law of peace to govern ourselves in our clans and to make our decisions that can account to be accountable to one another and be accountable to our families. And I thought, when it comes to this transition, it comes back to our families. And so, how do I go about this in terms of trying to implement projects that are for the good, trying to implement solutions that will make us healthier? And my one friend told me, she said, the best community engagement process is within our clan families. And so that's what I did. And so this is the Sour Springs Longhouse, and it's my family's longhouse, and it is our place of ceremony, governance, harvest, and funerals and death. It is a place where we live and have lived in the past, and really who we are as a people. I went to our chiefs and clan mothers and our faith keepers at the Longhouse, and I shared to them the work that I was doing at Sacred Earth. And what I truly believe to be a just transition is to be one within our families and within our culture and our Longhouse. And so this is where we actually decided since November 2022 to work on a Sour Springs Longhouse sustainable restoration project led by the hereditary governance of the Haudenosaunee at Sour Springs Longhouse, one of the only projects of its kind to really embody Indigenous sovereignty within the fabric of all decision making. And we decided to work on a 3-phase project with energy retrofits, with solar PV as well as food security. And that kind of led me on a journey to understanding when Indigenous peoples and Indigenous leaders have access to resources and teachings and knowledge, it can really illuminate and center the kind of solutions that we need to see in our world. And the amount of learnings that I gained working on this project is what I truly now see as the embodiment of a just transition. First learning was let's use less energy. Energy conservation and efficiency are an important first step. Understanding your community's energy use and ways of reducing energy demand is key. And so we did retrofits projects and we looked at, okay, how do we improve indoor air quality and how do we reduce the propane so it's a healthier space for our people? I think what's really beautiful about energy efficiency is it's not focused on profit, but it's actually focused on health, safety, and comfort. And I think that's the difference we need to see. And I also think with energy sovereignty, it's not just about lowering emissions and consumption, but it's about creating spaces of agency and spaces of comfort and durability. And so, with that being said, it also has this focus on conservation and sobriety and using less energy altogether. And I think that's something we really need to think about before we implement projects is how are we actually using less energy in our spaces? Because how we used to live before, we didn't have energy at all. And so if we can take that practice in that notion into the work we're doing, we can extract less, because I always get asked this question about critical minerals. Okay, the transition, you talk about renewable energy, but what about all the minerals being mined for the transition? And I say, okay, let's invest in energy conservation and efficiency then, and let's use less, because if we're using less energy, then there is less mineral extraction. The other lesson I learned is let's invest in our people. Capacity building leads to energy sovereignty. And we could see this by empowering our communities and developing the skill sets to own and maintain our own energy systems. We are able to supply reliable, clean energy to our people and become energy sovereign. Capacity building leads to employment, energy literacy, and increased community pride, while encouraging long term energy self sufficiency. So what we did is we trained 15 members in our longhouse, 15 of our men to work on solar installation as well as solar operations and maintenance, and they were all certified in both. And from there, then they were able to learn how to put rooftop systems up, how to put ground mounted, top of the pole, different solar systems. And this is them learning how to operate and diagnose issues in the projects, to them then being able to be the ones to actually implement our 24 kilowatt solar PV microgrid system that powers all 4 buildings on the longhouse. We built this ourselves, and it's because we invested in our people. And now we have plans for long term climate action planning in the community and thinking beyond even our own project and the possibilities for employment and career pathways. And then I think the other lesson I really learned was let's think beyond renewable energy. The just transition also encompasses our food systems, lands, and homes. And I think this is a really big one for me because I've always been told if you can't feed yourself, you can't be self sufficient and you can't be sovereign. So that's always been a teaching in the back of my head. And the really, when we think about the just transition, the principles and strategies of the just transition extend beyond our energy systems. They also advocate for just relationships with one another and with the natural world. A just transition must emphasize Indigenous food sovereignty, eco housing solutions, and how communities have harnessed the power of clean energy projects to align with traditional teachings and encourage cultural revitalization. And I think when we only think of renewable energy, when it comes to the just transition, we are limiting ourselves and we are siloing our solutions and our endeavors towards climate justice. And I think about the need that for us as Haudenosaunee, our seeds and our food are everything, and that's what makes us different, and it's what connects us to the earth. And so, a big idea that came out of this understanding around thinking beyond renewables was to build a seed storage facility at the longhouse so that everyone north of the medicine line, all Haudenosaunee peoples, would be able to have a centralized space to store, sort, and catalog Haudenosaunee seeds, and to um, prepare and increase our endeavors towards food sovereignty and food security. And I think this was really important of, okay, can we provide electricity ourselves? Yes. Can we provide our food ourselves now? This is what we're working on. And it just continues to create momentum towards our own sovereignty and self-determination as Haudenosaunee people. And so I think these are just some of these core learnings around these kinship approaches to a just transition that I've gained with working with our partners and communities across the country who really embody and understand what it means to be sovereign. And so, coming to more so the end of our presentation, and what I've also gained is that our communities are actively leading the way. We, Indigenous communities, are the largest change agents in clean energy across the country, as Indigenous communities are the largest asset owners of clean energy outside of utilities. We are not waiting for policy. We are not waiting for governments. We are just doing, and we have always done. And I think this is really such a beautiful, beautiful statistic that really shows how increasingly um, evident it is that Indigenous communities are pushing forward this transition and are really leading it. And so when we can say Indigenous peoples lead the transition, but they really are leading it. And we see this across the country. But I think we need to know that renewable energy is not the ultimate solution to entrenched inequalities endured by Indigenous communities from coast to coast. As I've mentioned, I don't believe renewable energy is the end all be all or is going to liberate us. And I do believe we must be critical and we must focus on Indigenous sovereignty to make sure that our solutions are holistic and come with care and love for each other and one another. Yet, from coast to coast, communities with a wide range of human and non-human resources initiate change for the better, working with the water, the wind, the sun, and the plants gifted to us by Creator. And so I'm just going to be ending off there, but I really appreciate the time to talk about what I understand as kinship approaches, and I think it's many different things, and I think we have to define it for ourselves, what a just transition means for ourselves. My one friend says, "You are the just transition." So you have to think of yourself, how am I initiating this ethos change within the communities that I work alongside to really create robust, healthy economies, but also lands and territories and families. And I think it's just really coming back to this place of love for yourself, love for one another, and love for the land and the waters that sustain us. And so, yes, I wanted to mention too, I thank you from Sacred Earth Solar, and just to touch on that, we launched a 180-page guide called The Just Transition in November 2023. And so throughout my presentation, the Just Transition Guide was loosely interwoven because a lot of those teachings that I've learned working on projects, we have also learned in initiating projects across the country and are all included within this wonderful guide that brings together 30 Indigenous communities and the work they're doing to illuminate what a just transition can look like for others and to learn from each other. And so this resource has been really essential in being able to share those stories and perspectives, as well as the knowledge and the technical skills it takes to implement a transition from a community lens. Because I was just in another speaking engagement today, and we're thinking very high level, very global. And I always bring it back home. That's where it matters, and that's where we can really make a difference. So Nyawagoa, and thank you so much for having me today. And I love talking about just transition. We always laugh that I live, eat, breathe just transition. But this is just a snippet into some of the work we do at Sacred Earth. And if you would love to we would love to stay in touch with you and continue to build efforts and unity around a just transition. So, yeah.
Wow, thank you, Serena. That was amazing. So exciting and inspiring, and really impressive, the work that you've been doing. I know there'll be questions, and folks can put them in the chat, and we're a small group here, so you can go off mute and ask questions too. So raise your hand if you want to ask a question that way. I have one to start. Um, Everything you said just fits so well into our Buen Vivir theme and the idea of degrowth, the idea of being responsible about our energy use and just reducing, as well as you said, that just replacing corporate fossil fuels with corporate renewable energy is not really a solution. So, I think everybody on this call agrees with all that. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how your Sacred Earth Solar got started. And I know you are the managing director. Did you start the organization, or how to tell us a little bit about the origin story of Sacred Earth Solar?
Thank you. And yes, I did not start the organization, but have been around for years now, and we have built the organization into something really amazing. But I would not want to take credit for the origin story of Sacred Earth that comes from our founder and executive director, Melina Labacon Massimo, who had been a climate and clean energy campaigner with Greenpeace for about 15 years and against the Alberta tar sands and the extractivism happening in Alberta. And her community is near the tar sands and actually faced the Rainbow pipeline oil spill. It was around 28,000 barrels of oil was leaked through, I'm pretty sure it was rain that impacted the pipelines and had created that leak. And I think in that sense, it was a really large burden to their community because they couldn't breathe. Their eyes were burning when they're outside. So they were facing these deep health implications that came from the pipeline and oil in the fossil fuel industry. And so Melina had already been a campaigner, but she thought, okay, we're in the heart of the tar sands and I've never seen solar energy here before. And I can talk till I'm blue in the face around the impacts and what's happening to our communities, but what is actually going to be a solution and how am I going to make our community healthier and support our people? And so that was implementing a solar project, the Pitapin, it's our flagship solar project that was a 20.8 kilowatt solar system on the health center. So it was powering the health center in the community as they had faced so many implications from the fossil fuel industry. And from there, Sacred Earth has grown. Now we used to focus solely on just like small scale infrastructure projects, both with like frontline communities. So we've worked with Wet'suwet'en, we've worked with Fairy Creek Blockade, we've worked with Tiny House Warriors, all in opposition to extractivism from pipelines to old growth logging. And now we're at this point of really building out our work beyond even just implementing climate solutions, but also seeing that capacity building is essential, seeing that we must advocate against these colonial legislations being put through, seeing that we must also heal as a people and focus on healing justice. And so that's been really this growth and story of Sacred Earth, but I would say we're extremely rooted in the front lines. Melina's been on a front line since she was a child. I've been on a front line since I was around 10 years old, 8 years old, and that's what we've been exposed to. So our work is completely grounded in the experience of Indigenous peoples on the front line and what world we're trying to create. And we support the land back movement within all the work that we do because we actually believe in the work land defense is doing to protect the planet. And there is a statistic in the Oil Change International and Indigenous Environmental Network Resistance Indigenous Resistance Against Carbon report, and they quantified the metric tons that Indigenous land defenders have actually stopped or delayed within Canada and the US over the last 10 years. And they showed that a quarter of annual Canada and US emissions were delayed or stopped by Indigenous land defenders. And so at Sacred Earth for us, it's like, okay, how do we support these movements and sustain these movements so that they can be safe, so that they can be comfortable and healthy? And that's really where our work was rooted. And in the beginning is, okay, do you need to charge your phone? Do you need to have a coffee machine? Do you need internet to plug in? Do you need access to electricity and lighting so you can stay in your tiny home? Stay in your tiny home and be comfortable because this is not just a one day thing. This is a months long battle. And so that's really where when it came to renewable energy of, okay, that's a way and a solution that we can support those on the front lines and we can sustain and nourish those movements because they're doing the real work. And that's also where healing justice comes in too of, okay, do people have access to wellness supports or to ceremony or to food or to like paying your phone bill? And that's all really what we embody healing justice as, supporting our wellness and ceremonial needs as Indigenous peoples, especially those who are working in the climate environment field. So that's a little bit about Sacred Earth and where we've come and what we believe in and how that has informed the rest of the work that we're doing.
All right, thanks for that, Serena. Wow, that's great. The connection with the land defenders. Didn't realize that at all. Okay, we have a couple hands up, so we'll go there first. Let's see, Jennifer, you want to go ahead?
Okay, I think Mark beat me, but I'll take
Oh,
the floor. Uh, I just want to say thank you so much, Serena, and also um, I I put solar on my house recently, and I can tell you that intellectually I understood that it was important, but the reality of living it, it embodied it is healing. It is literally a healing thing. So that's another aspect of what you're doing that I would not have understood if I hadn't experienced it myself. And also, I'm super into and supportive of the land back movement. And I'm really excited about what you're doing because it provides a path to making land back. Like people could understand like how it could work and also like why it could work because there's a intellectual leap there of, oh, well, we should give the land back to the people that like didn't fuck it up in the first place. But then also, here's how they're gonna make it work. So you already, my question was going to be, can you talk about the link between what you're doing in land back? And you kind of already did that. So like anything more you want to say about that, or I'm just that annoying person that has a comment and not a question.
Love it. It's very generative, and it's honestly my favorite thing to talk about is land back, and that's why I even do this work and that intersection where I showed that slide of like the climate justice movement, but it also the land back movement. And in when I showed that picture of Gunestado in the resistance that was in '06, I was 8 years old. My uncles and my aunties and my cousins and my family were all there, camped out for months, and all in pursuit of making sure that the coming faces and those next generations don't have to do this work. And it's now unfortunate that at my age, I am working alongside the organizers that I grew up with, looking up to, and they had done this work so I wouldn't have to. But now we're in this place that I do have to. And it is my obligation as a young person to fight for our land. And I didn't mention this in the presentation, but I when I came home for that summer and worked at the Dev Corp, and then I had left the Dev Corp because I was like, I don't want to work in that. That sounds horrible, and I don't want my people arrested. I had went back to school, but I was doing my master's, and it's funny, I was doing my master's in Indigenous environment and health. So we were looking in Pictou Landing First Nation. Basically, they were being impacted by a pulp and paper mill on their sacred body of water, ASEG, which actually the direct translation was the other room. So it showed how intimate that relationship was. And when the elders saw the pulp and paper mill in the 60s come up, they said that the fish were coming out of the water and they couldn't breathe. And they said it was honestly, and sorry, I can like get emotional thinking about that for them because I think it's what they said. It was just they had nothing else to say but I'm sorry and what they would say for another person. And so what we did is like land back in a nerdy way is we got community health baseline health data to be able to show that it was impacting their health, this pulp and paper mill. And so there was two sets of data, and that's kind of what I worked to support the community on. And eventually the project did get decommissioned because of this adverse health risks that were happening to the community. So I was doing this kind of work on the side. And then in 2020, when I was doing my master's back in at Western University, there was another land conflict that came up in my community. If you've heard of 1492 Land Back Lane, there was just across the street from Ganestado, that protected place, there was a new project. And sorry, that one is the Douglas Creek Estates was from Ganestado, and Mackenzie Meadows was the new development. So they're right beside each other. But there's 20 years difference, and they were going to do the exact same thing. And our people were like, heck no, that's not happening. And so tons of people came to this movement. It was July 2020 to protect our territory. And I had saw that while I was in university, and I said, okay, it's time to come home. And it's okay. Okay, I can do this work in all other communities and support people in the country, but what I need to do is bring it home. And I have been now since 2020 working on the land back initiatives in my community and supporting with another organization, Protect the Tract, that is enforcing our moratorium on development, that no development can happen without the consent of our people. And I'll make mention that we actually enforced that 4 years ago prior to Bill C5, where now everyone's saying enforce moratoriums on your land. We are like, we already did that. We've been working on this. But I just, in terms of this context of where I come from and what I'm rooted in, and why even sharing about that Sour Springs project is because of the work of our people. And okay, how do I sustain my own people and support my own people in these endeavors of enforcing our moratorium, of protecting our lands? I was living in a tiny home for a bit too, and all of these different cadences that come into this conversation, but it's really, I think, comes back to health, healing, and sovereignty for me. And I think this intersection, if I can provide climate solutions and resources that can support these movements towards that, then I think it's working. And I think I'm supporting the land back movement in my community in the way that it should be. And even I was saying that I had a teach-in the other day, before the session started, and we were focusing on Bill C5 and Bill 5, but it's also, I think, this pathway for us now with the land back movement of, okay, are we going to resist this legislation and try and get it rescinded and push the needle on Ontario legislation? Or this other pathway, are we just going to continue with what we've always done as Haudenosaunee people in resistance and continue to move forward our sovereignty as a nation? And so I've been dealing with over the last couple of weeks this divide and what I believe, and I think we can do both. But I also think it needs to be rooted in what's already been done, which is all the protection of the land in our territories. And I will say, mention that none of those lands have been developed on with the
Oh.
our community. Good stuff. And just, I come from a really strong people and really strong women who have invested in me, and that's why I do the work I do. And I know Mark has
Yeah.
another question, because I saw your question. I would love to continue to talk about that. So I'll pass it to you, Mark.
Well, thank you very much. It's been great having you with us. And I guess that one slide that said community-led versus First Nation owned, I wasn't quite clear of that. If you can just say a little bit about it.
Yes, and I know I went through that one. I definitely would love to talk about that one more. And it's honestly been something, as a person working in my community, working in clean energy, that I've come to is, I think a lot of the time in our communities, we have external proponents come into our communities and say, ooh, we have this really exciting project. We would love for you to sign on. And so the idea is not coming from us, and it was coming from external forces. So then they get us to sign on and they say, okay, we got Indigenous participation check mark, and we're like minimal equity owners on it. So I see like 10% equity owners. And so this, when I look at First Nations owned projects, and it's just a new kind of concept that I've been seeing around this difference that I don't think anyone else is talking about, but it's been something that's come to me, is so much of the time we just see these First Nations owned projects that the community has no say, no leadership within, really. They didn't define the needs of the project, they didn't define the outlook of the project, and they're just there to make some money. And I'm going to say that's not entirely bad, because if you're making a self-determining decision that you want really nothing to do with the project except to be a 10% equity owner, then that's okay too. But I think it's when we start to front First Nations owned projects as community led projects, and that's where it becomes problematic. And as someone who's invested now, like the past decade focusing on capacity building. I've worked with Indigenous Clean Energy, a national org that supports Indigenous communities with building clean energy projects. I was co-chair of 7Gen, an Indigenous Youth Energy Council that supports Indigenous youth getting into the clean energy sector. So as someone who is focused on capacity building, I can see the difference that comes when a project is coming from the ground up. And so a lot of the times communities will have roles or positions that are called community energy champions. And so with that, of taking this community-led approach, it's having someone housed in the community who is working on it, someone who worked on a community energy plan. And I think that's also where this community-led comes from, is did we actually get this in writing and hear from the people what they wanted? Community energy plans are these like beautiful documents. I've worked on a community plan, and these beautiful documents that outline everything that the community is saying. If it comes to consumption, it comes to solutions, comes to the needs, it comes to the gaps, all focusing on this energy, the energy portfolio of the community. And so that's where when you have a community energy plan, it's coming from the ground up because it's coming from the people. And you have this community energy champion who is going to be at the center of all the project. So they're the point person, not the engineer or the consultant isn't the one doing the project. It is this energy champion from community who is working on it and who builds this team that it's okay, we do need engineers, we do need contractors, we do need consultants, we need the governance, but it is still coming from the community. And I think that's the difference too, because when you do community energy plans, then you can outline what projects you need. Whereas half the time we saw with the Niagara reinforcement, or we saw with the Oneida energy storage, the province just really wanted it. They wanted to push that forward. They wanted something really flashy. I remember talking to my friend, and I hope he doesn't see this, but he works at the government, and he asked me, so what do you think if the government really pushes forward the publicity of this project? And I said, you better know that our people will come out swinging and they will say this is wrong and this shouldn't be happening. And we don't have the same perspective as many other people across the country. And so this concept of community led versus First Nations owned. I'm glad you asked about it, Mark, because it's just a new concept I feel like I've been talking about. And I think it's because I engage, as you can see, there's so many Indigenous communities who are actively in the transition in Canada, but are they asking themselves these critical questions? And I feel like I can only say this because I know for sure Six Nations is not. The Development Corporation isn't. They have about 1,800 megawatts of clean energy. And how I said, they barely have 100% equity ownership on any of that. So is there really capacity being built in the community? Because I know with equity ownership comes maintenance and risk. Okay, how are we preparing for that then if we actually want to be energy sovereign? I know, so this is, yeah, some of these thoughts that I just really think aren't being talked about when it comes to a just transition. And I think even just being on the We Can panel earlier, it was really interesting because they're very high level, they're very policy, and my perspective is really like grassroots, community based. How are we seeing this implemented in our communities? And I think everything is important, but I think a lot of the time perspectives like mine and people who come from community aren't included within policy and aren't included within legislation. As we can see with Bill C5 happening across Canada right now, where they gave time for amendments, and a lot of the NGOs said they're not even going to have time to take in these amendments. So it's really interesting how disconnected policy is from what's actually happening on the ground, but it's lovely to know that Indigenous peoples are moving forth whether or not the policy is catching up with them.
Thanks, Serena. And that's wow, you're very wise for your young age. And I know working in community, I'm sure has led to a lot of that. And it's really rewarding working in community and important. And at the same time, it can be messy and hard, as I'm sure you know. And I think that relates to Jeff's question here in the chat, which you might have seen. It says, I'm wondering if Serena has ever engaged in a citizens council when there are conflicts regarding land use, etc. If so, did these include both settlers and Indigenous people? How did it work out? did they result in solutions that were agreed to by all, or does just transitions really focus on self-sufficiency instead?
No, that's a good question. And I can say from what I know, Jeff, we have not ever engaged in a citizens council when there are conflicts. I think that could be a possible avenue within future momentum around the land back movement in our area, because I think many people are sick of it at this point, and not just Indigenous peoples. Um, because we in '06 with the Gunestado and the Douglas Creek Estates, it was really hostile environment. There was a lot of racism faced by our community with the neighboring Caledonia. But we could see that there was actually a difference within 2020 when the land conflict happened, that that same racism wasn't as apparent. And then I will say too that in there was also a land occupation in Brantford, which is the neighboring town beside Six Nations, and it was actually a Mohawk village in the past. And they did an occupation because they were going to, it was like 30 or 40 acres of a park that was a golf course, but it was untouched land, and they're going to develop it for housing. And so a lot of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in the community, they came together and said no, and they ended up getting sued for about 20 million at that point. But I think it really showed the need for us to come together, and the want for people to agree of like having the NIMBY people and the Indigenous peoples come together. And I think what was really telling in that too was that the municipality was trying to get the police to come and enforce an injunction and get people off of this land. The police didn't want to do it at this point. They said, we are literally helping their people dig up unmarked graves at their residential school, and we're going to go and take them off of their territory. And so I think that when you have even police not wanting to engage, I think it really says something. It's very surprising who didn't want to enforce that and didn't want to harm the Indigenous peoples on those lands, which very surprising, I know. But I think it's setting this like cultural shift. And so we haven't engaged in a citizens council, but I think there could be possibilities of it. And I would say the only other thing that I came across, not having the citizens council, but in '06 there was a mediation. So I think it's been like prominent mediation processes. My grandma was actually the mediator, one of the mediators within the conflict that brought together Ontario, the Confederacy, the band, and the OPP and the different parties involved. But I think there's this need and this difference in um not everyone's voices are still not included, right? It's only within like if you have a leadership role. And so I think there is com coming forth this necessity to build up these mechanisms and these democratic processes among shared relations and shared territories for us to come together. So if you want to stay in touch, would love to hear more. And then I see, does transition really focus on self-sufficiency instead? And I think for us to, in Six Nations, obviously we focus on our land rights and our focus on our sovereignty. But I think being in a community that is completely surrounded by urbanization, and at the point we're all going to have to come together in essence of Indigenous sovereignty and Haudenosaunee leadership to protect our territories. Because right now, I think our sovereignty as Indigenous peoples is the only thing that is upholding the protection of these territories, and is our only opposition to be able to push forth on the federal governments and the Ontario governments. And so if we can all band together, knowing that we all believe that the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples are on these lands, that I think we would be able to move forward in a path of, and I don't really use the word reconciliation, but unity among all of us, and in pursuit of a better future. So yeah, that's just some of my thoughts around that. But no, I haven't, and would love to learn more of how we can push forward these kinds of mechanisms in place. But yeah, I know we're coming to the end of time, and I'm actually in a hotel room, so I'm gonna get kicked out. But I wanted to thank you all today for the really amazing questions and for sitting with me for the last hour. because obviously I really like to nerd out about this stuff, and so it's nice to meet like-minded individuals as well.
Thank you so much, Serena. It's been our pleasure. It's really exciting, especially for most of us that I work with that are quite a few years older than you, to see young people really engaging with this in such a productive and powerful way. So I really appreciate that. Thanks to our guests, our audience, for being here. And Serena, wish you all the best with your work. Thank you.
Thank you. Please stay in touch, everyone. Feel free, the Scientist Rebellion has my email. Feel free to stay in touch and check out Sacred Earth. So yeah, Nyawagoa, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.